Okay, and while that's doing its magic, let's go back here and click share. Okay, and that's up and running. That's up and running. All right, well, just a little bit of flailing about to get everything in place. I think we're okay now. At least says it's okay now. All right, hopefully you can hear me fine and the link is working. And we're going to go ahead and give this a shot and hope that it works better than it did last week. Last week, the whole computer shut down, but it looks like I've got the heating under control. So really, this shouldn't be a problem. So you are welcome to go back to last week's part 1, which only went in about 10 minutes. It was just the beginning here of chapter 3 of the book of Deuteronomy. Most importantly, of course, we're talking about the attack by King Og of Bashan. And Og was famous for being like one of the Anakim, like one of the giants. Now, there's more of the background and history in last week's tiny bit when it cut off. But we're going to jump in so that we have plenty of time, barring computer accidents, to get through the whole thing. So we're going to pick up just at verse 11, get to the meat that we're going to need to scratch our heads about, and take it from there. So here in verse 11, we refocus ourselves on Og in particular, not just the battle and the exchange of territory, but himself. For only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the rest of the Rephaites, or Rephaim. Here, his couch was a couch of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits its length, 4 cubits its width, by the cubit of a man. Right? So that's all one rhetorical question. How low is it not? All the way from that point until the end. So it's saying, isn't his old couch or bed in many translations still found in Rabbah, which is, by the way, the modern city of Amman, the capital of the state of Jordan? Isn't it still there? And can't you go and see that it is 9 cubits long? Okay, so 9 cubits. We've got to try and work out what we mean by a cubit. The general rule of thumb is that a cubit is the distance between the middle finger and the elbow. Now, that obviously is different for different size people, but various scholars have advanced an equivalency for the modern world of about 18 inches. So anytime you see 9, simply add an additional 50% of that. So half of 9 is 4.5, which would make his bed 13.5 feet long, and it would make it 6 feet wide. Now, the question then becomes, what kind of person slept in that bed? That person was 13 feet tall. That is enormous. And one of the underlying questions that we're going to take a look at today is not just more about Og himself and how he figures in rabbinic tradition, but also how do we handle coming across a passage which seems to be telling us in a very matter-of-fact way that there was a 13-foot tall person that the Israelites defeated and thus took control of that territory. We know from modern biology that a 13-foot tall person is physiologically impossible, that there is no way for the bone, muscle, heart, and all of the various pulmonary systems and cardiovascular as well to work together to keep such a human being alive once they reach that size. We are simply not built like that. That's not the way our anatomy functions. So the question then is, well, is the Torah lying? Is the Torah exaggerating? How do we understand this this piece of information. Now, we're going to do all of this using our classical sources. So this is not a question of a modern reflection on the works of the ancient. This is a question of classical reflections on the works of our people. So let's go through and take a look at some of those classical works and see what they do with this giant problem. Yes. Sorry, it's been one of those days. All right, so let's pick it up here with Rashi, because Rashi is a great place to always begin. So who were these Rephaim, right? Who are these giants that we are talking about? Well, Rashi wants to give us a what is known as conservation of character explanation. What I mean by conservation of character is there is a very strong tradition, in this case based on Bereshit Rabbah, to find characters that are not well named at some point in the Tanakh, and then attach them to another named character somewhere else. This way, we can tie stories together that might otherwise appear to be disconnected. So, case in point, so who are these rest of the Rephaim? Well, they are whom Amraphel and his allies slew in Ashtaroth Karnaim. Now, this is back in the giant battle that gets Lot captured out of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, chapter 14 in the book of Genesis. Very important, very interesting chapter that everybody skips, unfortunately. So in any case, in this chapter, during the midst of the battle, somebody escaped from the battle. And that person is the one that brings news of Lot's capture to Abraham and thus sets the rest of the story in motion. Now, what does our Midrash say? Well, that is to say, Og, escaped from the battle. As it is said, and the fugitive came, and that was Og. So Bereshit Rabbah attaches the idea that Og and this fugitive are one and the same people. Now, why would this be a good place to attach Og? I mean, after all, we could have attached him to any other named figure later on that might have still been alive at that time, and the sages have no problem extending lifespan to make these character connections possible. Well, because by creating the fugitive as Og, we are then making the victory of Abraham even greater. If, after all, Amraphel and the others were able to defeat an army that had Og in it, then, and he was now a fugitive, then the fact that Abraham could then turn around and defeat that army and free not only Lot, but all the other captives, that makes Abraham's victory even greater. So perhaps, and we're going to come back to this topic again, but perhaps the Midrash is attaching Og here because Og is a symbol of might, a symbol of strength, and thus by having him be the fugitive, it creates an even greater victory for Abraham. All right, so that's one way we can try to understand this guy. Now, when we look just a chapter back in Deuteronomy 2, we see that the people here, the Rephaim and this whole area, are also getting, well, a bit of a glow up, but also not doing so well. You will then be close to the Ammonites. Do not harass them or start a fight with them, for I will not give any part of the land of the Ammonites to you as a possession. I have assigned it as a possession to the descendants of Lot. All right, so Lot, being the nephew of Abraham, well, he had two children through rather delicate means involving his daughters that then became an extended part of the map of the ancient Near East, and ones that were then set aside, that we should not make war against them and we should not seize their territory, that it was reserved for them. Now, it goes on to say, it too is counted as Rephaim country, meaning the land of Ammon. It was formerly inhabited by Rephaim, whom the Ammonites call Damzumim, a people great and numerous and as tall as the Anakites. The Anakim were the giants of the ancient world. So this land had the term Rephaim because at one point there were people who were there that were like the Anakim, who were like the giants. But Adonai wiped them out. So the Ammonites dispossessed them and settled in their place, as God did for the descendants of Esau who live in Seir by wiping out the Horites before them, so that they dispossessed them and settled in their place, as is still the case. So Devarim, the book of Deuteronomy, is giving a little bit of an aside of the history of the region and pointing out that the Ammonites were not always the people that were dominant in this area. At one point, there were the Rephaim, and the Rephaim were like the Anakites. They were like giants, but God wiped them out, and so the Ammonites were able to take over. And the same thing, minus the giants, happened with Esau's descendants who lived in Seir. So there's a couple of things that we can take away from this. One, we are explaining why Og is the last of the Rephaim, why he is the end of this lineage, because they had already been mostly displaced by the Ammonites. But two, we can also see that the Torah is firmly aware that it was the common activity of the ancient world for one group to displace another group, for the Ammonites to displace the Rephaim, for the Edomites, the children of Esau, to displace the Horites, that this was just what was always going on. However, part 3 of that also then tells us that this was not just random fighting, that this allocation, this dispossession, was something that was in harmony with what God wanted to achieve. So we have God acting on behalf of other nations as well. It is not only with us that God is involved in history. Okay, but let's go back to our specific text here. Moses is told to fear him not, right? That he is given a specific warning to not fear Og. Now, of course, if there's a specific warning, then we have to ask why the specificity. God said this, don't fear him, concerning Og, but not about Sihon, which was another one of the main enemies at that period, because Moses feared to wage battle. Why would he be afraid to have a fight after all? We've won every fight we've been in that we were supposed to be in. Perhaps the merit of Abraham, with whom Og had been associated, would stand up for him. As it is said, going back to Genesis 14, and the one who escaped came and told to Abraham, this was Og, who had escaped from Rephaim when Chedorlaomer and his allies had smitten in Ashtaroth Karnaim. As it is said, for only Og, king of Bashan, was left, like a refugee, was the only one who had escaped of the Rephaim. So Rashi, bringing here from the Midrash and the Talmud, is trying to give us a reason why Moses would be especially afraid. And you'll note it's not that Og is a giant. It is not that Og is big and strong. It is that Og may have zechut, he may have merit that comes from Avraham, because after all, if we read the Midrash that Og was the messenger that escaped and came and told Avraham about what happened to Lot, then he has done Abraham a favor, and therefore the merit of Abraham may also protect him, because one who blesses is blessed. He blessed Abraham with the assistance of his family, and therefore he would have received a blessing in return. And that was what Moses was afraid of. Now we can see that the Midrash is doing something very special here. It is trying to emphasize the character of Og rather than the physicalness of Og. Most of the time when people talk about Og, they focus on him being a giant. They focus on how tall he was and how strong he was, and as we're going to see, what he lifted and all of that. But here we see him being associated with Abraham, as Abraham's merit being his shield, not his own physical strength being his shield. And that, of course, then says the only reason Moses would ever be afraid of someone would be if they actually had some merit that would mean that God would be at least partially on their side, if at least would not allow them to fail categorically. So we can see that Rashi, channeling the rabbinic text, is trying to give us that perspective, that it's not only about Og's head to toe measurement that we should be concerned. It is about the other elements. And of course, that is meant to give us extra strength, extra hope that when we look at enemies that look stronger and bigger than us, we should not be wondering how tall are they, but we should be wondering how deep are they? What deep merit might they have? What strength can they draw upon from goodness, from righteousness? Because it's easy to overcome one that is merely tall. It is harder to overcome somebody that is actually great in spirit. And of course, the greatness here is attached to Abraham. Now, with that in mind, we're going to explore the Abraham connection a little bit more in depth here. So we are looking now in one of the sections of the Talmud called Sofrim. And there are a lot of different stories in this part of the Talmud. And as we're going to see, we have an option. We can either read the story as being fairy tale central, or we can read the story as being extended metaphor and allegory that has been blended together to try and teach us many different things, but none of them have to do with fairy tale style things. And so this is something we're going to read through, and we're going to try and take it apart in both directions, just to show that the sages of Sofrim would not have wasted our time with a fairy tale. So, the greatest man among the Anakim. This is a quote from the book of Joshua. Well, among the Anakim, when we say among the Anakim, who were the other Anakim? Well, this refers to our father Abraham. Wait, Abraham was an Anak? Abraham was a giant? Well, apparently, his height was equal to that of 74 men. So Abraham was taller than 74 people, which is a lot bigger than 13 cubits. 13 feet. He's a lot bigger than the 9 cubits of the bed that we were using as our benchmark for bigness a little while ago. And Abraham's eating and drinking were of similar proportion, equal to those of 74 men. So too his strength. All right, so fairy tale version tells me that we've got an Abraham that is hundreds and hundreds of feet tall, and that he is eating from massive amounts of food, the equivalent of 74 men, and that he was just as powerfully strong as you would expect from 74 people all wrapped up together. Now, that's kind of interesting, but is that really something to be preserved? And is that something that is attested to in any other place within Tanakh? And the answer for the latter is definitely not. And the answer to the former would be, well, what would we benefit by? How would we benefit from knowing that Abraham happened to be this tall? What good would that do for us in our living? Because remember, the Torah was designed in order to improve our lives. Knowing that Abraham was very, very tall doesn't seem to have an impact. And yet, if we hold on to this metaphor, we'll see that this information in a metaphorical, in an allegorical way, can be very important. But to do that, we have to see what Abraham did with this strength. What did he do? Well, he removed the 16 sons of Keturah. Those were Abraham's children after Isaac. Remember, he had Ishmael first, and then Yitzchak, and then after Sarah died, he married Keturah. Lots to say about her in another day. And from Keturah, he had additional children. So he had those 16 sons, his own children from Keturah, his third, maybe first wife, or maybe second wife, a little complicated there. And he built for them a walled city of iron and settled them in it. Of course, to wall a city of iron would be the ultimate symbol of strength, because iron is stronger than stone. And if you could build a wall entirely made of iron, well, that would be a strong place to be. And the sun never penetrated into it because it was exceedingly high. Now, you're probably wondering, how would your height matter for how much sun you got? Well, to understand that, you have to understand the cosmology of the ancient authors. They, of course, did not believe, not that they were against it, they just never considered it, but they did not think that we went around the sun. They thought the sun went around the earth. And as the sun went around the earth, it went across a dome. rakia, the firmament, as it's often translated. And if the sun went across the dome, that anything so tall that it was higher than the dome would mean the sun was shining below it, but not up. So they would actually be in darkness because they were higher than the level of the dome in which the sun traveled. So Abraham has to help them because they need light. So he handed to them discs of precious stones and pearls, of which use will be made in the hereafter, when the Holy One, blessed be he, will cause the sun and moon to be confounded, as it is written in the prophetic works, when the moon shall be confounded and the sun ashamed, because use will be made of these discs as luminaries. Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. So first of all, let's take care of the sun and moon issue here. Prophecy says the sun and the moon will be confounded. Here is a way that that could be understood, meaning that the people will have light that comes from these other sources, and therefore the sun and the moon will no longer be necessary as the primary source of illumination. That would be quite, well, a come down for these great lights that have shone on the world and been the only source of light for millennia. And now they are being supplanted by these additional discs. Now, what are these discs? What are these precious stones, these pearls? Well, excuse me. We can think of these as fairy tales, as it's the captured light of a star held in a jewel of some kind. You know, we can go down the Tolkien path with the gift from Galadriel. But more likely, our ancestors understood this metaphorically, that this was an usurpation of the normal laws of the world, because the normal laws of the world said that things that were big and things that were strong, they were the most important. The sun, the moon, they are enormous. They are, in fact, the two largest things that we ever see in our existence. And yet, they will be set aside because something that is much smaller turns out to actually be able to produce a light which is even greater. Okay, now that is entirely a metaphor for the Jewish people and for the righteous of all that often feel at the wrong end of the power spectrum of the world, that the high and mighty, the great and powerful tended to be in the ancient world fairly horrible people, and they tended to do fairly horrible things. And it seemed like, well, yeah, the bigger you are, the more power you have, and the more you get what you want. And this is saying, nope, in the end, God will actually change the world to such that those who look like they are the least, who are small, will nonetheless have the greatest power, the greatest light, the greatest joy in the world. And this idea of setting aside his sons is that if Abraham would go to such lengths to protect these sons, then surely for Isaac, of which we are the descendants, Abraham as well would have protected us. And after all, he is an incredibly powerful person, metaphorically represented by his 74 person stature, but more importantly by his spiritual stature. Now, with that, we're going to make an additional conservation of character. And that is to say, in our next paragraph, Og is identical with Eliezer, Abraham's servant. So there's a servant that works with Abraham. He is the one who goes and finds Rivka for Isaac. And we are now saying that Og and Eliezer and the fugitive who came in the battle are all the same guy. And he, Og, was so huge that he could hide Abraham's feet in the palm of his hand. All right, anybody who's ever had a newborn baby in their hands will know that, you know, a full adult hand can hold their feet in their hand, and it is just a remarkable moment of reflection on scale, and of course the fact that child will one day grow to be a full adult, but at this moment they are so tiny and fragile. Well, we just said Abraham was 74 people tall, and now we are saying Og is so massive that he could hold Abraham's feet in his hand, meaning that he was to Abraham as an adult would be to a newborn when it came to the stature. However, despite Eliezer being physically taller, Once Og was rebuked by Abraham, and from fright his tooth fell out. So just when Abraham would say, you did that wrong, meaning you had a moral failing, there was something you did that was inappropriate. Just from that moment, Og, Eliezer, this refugee, was so afraid of having done wrong by Abraham that one of his teeth fell out. And to magnify his size again, Abraham picked it up and made ivory beds of it, in which he slept. Others say that he made of it a chair, which he used all of his life. Okay, so that's how big Og was, that one of his teeth was big enough for Abraham to sleep in, and Abraham was 74 people long, which would make one tooth of Og 74 people long. It's kind of a big scale, especially given, didn't we say that he was only 9, that his bed was only 9 amot long, 13.5 feet? We seem to have gotten him up to like miles tall now, and yet we only had him sleeping in a 9 amot bed, a 9 from here to here. That does not add up to his tooth is bigger than 74 people. All right, well, we're going to have to hold on to that. So let's keep going a little bit because the Sophrim is not done. Who gave him, Og, to Abraham? Where did Eliezer come from, this giant? And the answer was Nimrod. Og went and built 60 cities, the smallest of which was 60 miles high. As it is stated, 3 score cities, all in the region of Argob. And what did he eat? 1,000 oxen, and the same number of other animals, and his drink consisted of 1,000 measures, and a drop of his semen weighed 36 pounds. Now, do we really think that this was essential detail that our sages needed to preserve because it was just such a great story? That's not the way the Talmud or other rabbinic literature was written. This is not the Brothers Grimm collecting the tales of Germany. This is meant to be text that is guiding us in our life. So what are we saying about his consumption? What are we saying about his bodily fluids? Well, what we are saying is that he was somebody that was larger than life. Literally, his drop of life is twice the numerical value of life, chai, which is 18. But this is somebody that was perhaps a little too large, and perhaps somebody that had a consumption rate, had a drain upon the world that was more than was necessary. And with that in mind, we're going to see that whatever he might have done for Abraham, by the time he came around to Moses's day, we see a very different attitude towards him in rabbinic literature. So now we're moving to a different part of the Talmud, Brachot 54b. And this is a small excerpt from the story of Og that's there. It's only so much I can fit on my pages. So please go and look at the rest. But this, I hope, will at least keep us on track for understanding how we should understand this giant problem. With regard to the rock that Og, king of Bashan, sought to throw upon Israel. So there was an earlier passage that said he picked up a rock that he was going to destroy the people of Israel with. Well, there is no biblical reference, meaning it doesn't actually say what the rock was like in Torah. But there was a tradition that was transmitted. So the rabbis are admitting that this is not based upon a biblical exegesis, but that this is instead something that has been passed down person to person to person. The Gemara relates that Og said, how large is the camp of Israel? Like how big is their encampment? And he was told it is 3 parasangs. Now, parasang is an ancient measurement of about 3.5 miles. So we're just going to round that off to about 10 miles. So that's how big the camp is, which, by the way, is way too big for the actual, at least, people who would have been settling there. But that's the number that's being used. So I will go and uproot a mountain, 3 parasangs long, and I will hurl it upon them and kill them. So one shot, and they'll all be dead, because I'll drop a rock on them that's as big as them. So he went, and he uprooted a mountain 3 parasangs long. So understand now, he is being seen as somebody big enough to hold up a mountain that is 10 miles across. So that shows him as being multiple times 10 miles big, because you can't normally hold something up big enough to throw it at someone unless you're bigger than it. So he holds it up and he sets it on his head and he's going to move it over to get ready to drop on the Israelites. And the Holy One, blessed be he, brought grasshoppers upon it, and they pierced the peak of the mountain and it fell on his neck. So he's holding this rock up on his head, and all of a sudden these bugs are gnawing away at it. And because it was resting on his head, it then slips down around his neck so that it is like a giant collar around him. And then the story concludes, well, how tall was Moses? Because after all, Moses is fighting him. Well, Moses was 10 cubits tall, and he took an axe 10 cubits long, and he jumped up 10 cubits and struck Og in the ankle and killed him. So if Moses is 10 and his axe is 10, meaning so that when he's reaching up with it, he's hitting now 20 cubits tall, and then he jumps 10 cubits, so now he is hitting a place 30 feet off the ground. That's what they're trying to say. And at 30 feet off the ground, Moses was still only hitting the ankle of Og. Now, none of that math makes sense, because if Og was big enough to hold a mountain that was 10 miles across, there's no way that his ankle would be within 45 feet of the ground. Maybe, the beginning of the curve of his toe would be within 45 feet of the ground, but this is somebody whose head is in the upper atmosphere, and therefore the foot would have been so enormous that it would not have just been a 45-foot jump to the ankle. More importantly, the rabbis aren't trying to make a statement about real size. And we're going to come back to that whole his bed was 9 cubits in a minute, because that seems to be a big problem here. But the fact is, the rabbis were not looking just to tell us exactly how big Og was, because just like in Tractate Sophrim, that is not the primary point. Instead, the point is to try and say, look, there might be somebody out there who has the physical strength to literally kill us in one go. Let's call them, I don't know, Babylon, Assyria, Rome, the Seleucid Empire. There are many that have had power to try and destroy us in one go. And yet, no matter how powerful they are, even and up to the point of wielding mountains, they can still be brought down because of some grasshoppers. That there are still tiny forces in the world that can reduce and completely neutralize their strength. And so when we are faced with a threat like that, we don't think that we're done. We don't think that we're lost. We don't think everything is over. Instead, we think there has to be a way to be able to overcome this. There has to be a way to defeat this, because no amount of brute strength is ever going to upend the destiny that our people have. And that is what is trying to be related here. That even at a threat such as this, we can still expect that there will be some form of miraculous deliverance that will bring it about. Now, if we have that in mind, then the next midrash hopefully will make a little bit more sense. So Rabbi Yochanan said, Og's feet were 18 cubits long. At the time, Moses grew afraid. The Holy One said, do not fear, like we talked about before. I will make him fall before you. Og would uproot a mountain, just like we saw, and throw it at the Israelites. So here, in this version of the Midrash, the mountain actually gets airborne, and Moses would take a pebble, recite the divine name on it, and deflect it. All right. Again, this is not about how we would stage this for Hollywood. This is about if there is a threat, even of a mountain, then with the power and knowledge of God, we will be able to overcome it. It's not about I said the right word and then it got deflected. This is about what is the nature of our nation? What is the nature of us individually that allows us to overcome problems? It is not meeting mountain with mountain. We can meet a mountain with a pebble as long as we are following the path of Torah, as long as we are following the path of the wisdom of our people. That is where true strength lies. Now, throughout this, we've been going back and forth about how tall Og was. We had the 9 amot bed. We've got 74-foot tall or 74-person tall Abraham, who was shorter than Og. We just had jumping 45 feet and hitting only the ankle. We just saw 18-foot long feet. Well, these don't seem to work well for each other. But our tradition does have a solution to this, and Rashi brings it, which is when we said that Og's bed was 9 cubits long, it had at the end of that statement a very unnecessary phrase, the amat ish, right? In the amma of a man, by the cubit of a man. Well, one might think, and indeed many people do, that it just means according to the standard cubit, right? That this is the normal cubit that everybody uses. But our tradition also offers an alternative, which is that this was the cubit of a man, not, the standardized king's cubit, but this was in fact the cubit of Og. So now, what was Og's bed? It was 9 cubits long, but it was 9 cubits long from Og's fingertip to Og's elbow. So that means it is a relative number rather than an absolute number. So as you scale Og up to be 10 miles high, then that means his bed would have been 10 miles long, because it would be proportional to the cubit that he created based off his own body and the size of his own limbs. So therefore, nothing is broken. When it says it's 9 cubits, it means it's 9 cubits based upon Og, and we're okay. Now, if you're finding that slightly unsatisfactory, you are in good company, because many of our other sages do not think that that literally works. They're not trying to say that that is a problem midrashically. Of course, we can use this to help us understand the idea of Og was measured according to Og, and the rest of us are measured according to us, and that trying to compare two people is really an exercise in futility. But if we were trying to take this as a literal statement, which unfortunately many people have tried to do, then, well, there's a problem, which even Ezra tries to come up with. So after the cubit of a normal person, this amat ish, this cubit of a man, is not Og's cubit. This is a normal person's cubit, like one would probably have assumed. Observe, Og was double in size. It is unlikely that the Torah is speaking of Og's cubit. For if this were so, then what is Scripture trying to teach? Furthermore, he would not have the image of a person at all. All right, so there's 2 very important points. We'll take the second one here first, that he would not have the image of a person at all. This is Ibn Ezra trying to say in a way that in the modern world we would put, he would no longer anatomically, he would no longer have the anatomy of a human being. That if you tried to make somebody as big as these various versions are, if you were trying to take that literally, he couldn't look like a human. Every time somebody just scales up a human in Photoshop and puts them, next to the Statue of Liberty, it may look fine in the photo, but that's not the way a human being would work. That if you actually made them large like that, well, there's a whole biological principle known as the cube square law, which has to do with how much volume you increase based upon how much height you've added. And the fact is that no structure of humanity would be able to keep up with that. And if it did, if you actually had a flesh and blood person, it wouldn't look like a person anymore. It would be this bizarre column legs that would, be overflowing each other with bones, trying to buttress this massive weight. It wouldn't look like a human anymore. And even Ezra, 800, 700 years ago, already understood that this was a problem. But the second line, it is unlikely the Torah is speaking of Og's cubit, for what is it trying to teach, is, I believe, even more important, because it is trying to tell us that the Torah wasn't wasting words. When it said that his bed was 9 amot, it was trying to make the reader think of a particular length. That if you say 9 amot to the average person, especially at the time the Torah was given, they could immediately picture, roughly at least, how big that was. The same way that if I say, oh, there's a new basketball player and he's 8 foot tall, you would be able to look, in your room and look at the wall and you could say, okay, so he's probably standing about there. Wow, that's really tall. You would know what it was. But if I told you there's a new basketball player and he's 10 times tall, he's 10 times the length of his own foot. Well, how big's his foot? If you don't tell me how big his foot is, then you haven't told me anything. That you've made a completely relative statement, and out of that, I can't picture anything. The Torah is wasting its time by telling me how big the bed is if it doesn't tell me how big the unit of measurement is. And this is just a wonderful insight all the way into the modern world, where if we don't define terms, it's impossible to have good conversation about anything significant. But it's trying to tell us, very importantly, the Torah believes that these things matter, and it's not going to give you a number just to throw out a number. It wants you to generate an image and to then use that image to understand the story. So Ibn Ezra comes along and says, no, he was actually big enough that his bed was 9 cubits long, about 13.5 feet, and that's what he slept in. And he is hypothesizing that this means that Og was probably double the height of an average person. Now, does that sound big? Well, you have to remember the average person wasn't exactly 6-7 foot tall back in the ancient world. And that is going to lead us into our next text, which is from Rambam and his Guide for the Perplexed. So let's do a little bit of reality checking. What Scripture says about Og, behold, his bedstead was an iron bedstead 9 cubits in length, like we've talked about. This does not belong to this class of figures. So in this section of the Guide for the Perplexed, part 2, chapter 47, Rambam has been talking about how many numbers in Torah are given as idealized numbers or archetypical numbers or numbers that are there for a reason other than actual counting. That sometimes the number is there as the message itself, not meant to be taken as a precise digit. This, however, the 9-cubit bedstead, that doesn't actually fit that category. This one could be perfectly fine. How does he believe that? For the bedstead is never exactly of the same dimensions as the person using it. It is not like a dress that fits around the body. It is always greater than the person that sleeps therein. As a rule, it is by a third longer. So he's saying, look, if you look at an actual bed and you put a person in that bed, the person and the bed are not identical. So yeah, his bed was 9 cubits long, but if it's average for most people to be a little bit shorter than their bed, then he would have been shorter than his bed too, which makes him about 6 cubits tall. So if, therefore, the bed of Og was 9 cubits in length, he must, according to this proportion, have been 6 cubits in length, or a little more. How big is 6 cubits? Well, again, we would take the 1.5 measure in the modern world, which would work out, if our math is right, to be about 9 foot tall. The words by the cubit of a man mean by the measure of an ordinary man and not by the measure of Og. For men have the limbs in a certain proportion. Scripture thus tells us that Og was double as long as an ordinary person, or a little less. This is undoubtedly an exceptional height among men, but not quite impossible. And in this he is right. Now, a 9-foot person is, as near as we can tell, definitely pushing the edge of what physically could even work as a human being. But certainly there are humans that are 8 foot tall, and they are absolutely exceptional, but they are not impossible. And as such, the bed being 9 cubits long would be perfectly understandable for somebody that was, let's say, 8 foot tall. You got your tallest NBA star. They're going to have a bed that's about the same length as Og. And that puts Og neatly in the category of reality, rather than as being one of the numbers that is not trying to describe a literal physical entity. Now, does that mean everything we read before about the height of Og and giant teeth and all of that was just made up? No, it was there in order to teach us about the strength of Og, about the power of Og, and about the power of Abraham and the power of Moses and the power of us. And that, I hope, will be made clearer as we go forward. First, a little bit more about Chizkuni, who's going to be even more radical than Rambam when talking about this size issue. A bedstead made of iron, he wants to fixate on that. This need not be understood literally, meaning it doesn't have to even be his bed. It means that the materials used in constructing the city walls were as sturdy as if they had been made out of strong metal. That his bedstead, meaning the place where he rested, which is his city, was made of iron, means it was as strong as iron, and that it was 9 cubits long. This is the average height of the walls of walled cities in those days, while the depth of the wall was 4 cubits. That the 9 and 4 measurement was just the city walls. And yeah, they were big, they were strong, and yet we prevailed over them. The exact same story is going to happen in Jericho in just a little while. So Chizkuni makes this an even more explicitly natural type of situation. But the Maharal is the one who I think gives us the best way to try and understand not just the text itself, but also the midrashim that we have looked at that can sometimes feel like a fairy tale. Every person has 2 aspects. One, his physical form, which is common to the entire species. Right? I'm a human being, you're human beings in every continent across the planet, and we may have variety. Some are taller, some are shorter, some are older, some are younger, but we're all the same species. We're all stamped from the same die. But every person also has a personal inner form, a spiritual form. Sometimes the sages that said so-and-so was such and such a height, they attributed huge dimensions to him. This too is from the perspective of his inner form, even though it cannot be actualized in the physical world because of the general form of human beings, since every person is created within the framework of the laws of nature. And these dictate that a person cannot be so small or so big. So when the rabbis wanted to say such and such was this tall, we don't have to read that as being they actually thought somebody was big enough to lift a 10-mile wide mountain. Instead, the person had an inner power, an essence to themselves that was enormous. And it was something that we should take into account when we then see them being defeated, or when we see ourselves able to overcome such a challenge. That is even something like that we can overcome. But we shouldn't read it as being necessarily that was actually how big they were physically if we had a tape measure to measure them. But does that mean there's no room then for miracles and giants and amazing things that just overawe us? Well, yes and no. Right? We should not be so gullible that every time we see something that looks fantastic, we immediately assume that it is the most fantastic version we could possibly imagine, because boy, wouldn't that be impressive. It's really tempting to do that because we often feel like we are somehow giving more credit to God or more credit to Torah or more credit to our ancestors when we over actualize the physical of what they existed, of how they existed. But we also shouldn't be so skeptical that we leave no room for things that are beyond our understanding, that are beyond our representation of the laws of nature to the extent that science has uncovered them to this point. And Rambam, I think, gives us a good rule of thumb to try and follow. Our efforts and the effort of select individuals, meaning to try and understand the way the world works and the way the Torah speaks of it, are in contrast to the efforts of the masses. Rambam was quite an elitist and didn't have high opinions about many people. For with the masses, who are people of the Torah, that which is beloved to them and tasty to their folly is that they should place Torah and rational thinking as two opposite extremes, and will derive everything impossible as distinct from that which is reasonable. And they say that it is a miracle, and they flee from something being in accordance with natural law, whether with something recounted from past events, with something that is in the present, or with something which is said to happen in the future. So there are way too many people, says Rambam, that when you tell them that in the future we will have pearls that illuminate the world as much as the moon does now, that will say, that is amazing and wonderful, and please do not try to explain that to me. I just want to imagine the super moon bright pearl, nothing else, because rational thinking is the opposite of Torah, the opposite of being a spiritual, passionate, believing person. I can't do the same thing. They are completely separate, and leave me alone. Let me believe what I want to believe, and that should have no bearing whatsoever on anything else in the world, and nothing else in the world should have any bearing on what I believe. But we, meaning Rambam and the select individuals that he respects, we shall endeavor to integrate the Torah with rational thought, leading events according to the natural order wherever possible. Only with something that is clarified to be a miracle and cannot be otherwise explained at all will we say that it is a miracle. It is tempting to want to say that all of these things are amazing miracles and that God could make somebody that was beyond the scope of humanity's understanding, a 10-mile tall giant, and isn't that amazing? Isn't God great? It is tempting to want to say that makes God greater. But the fact is that it does not. Right? God's greatness is God's greatness, and it is infinite, regardless of whether God has made giants or whether God hasn't made giants, according to our Jack and the Beanstalk mentality. Instead, we should be trying to understand what the Torah is actually teaching, what the Tanakh is actually teaching, and what our sages are actually teaching. And we do them a disservice by trying to imagine them in the most credulous and gullible version, by trying to set aside the gift that God gave us of a rational mind while trying to analyze that to which our mind should be most devoted to the words of the Torah itself. Do we honestly imagine we'll understand the Torah best if we think about it the least? No. We understand best when we use all of the tools at our disposal to understand. And that still leaves plenty of room for miracles, because there are definitely some places where our logic, our science, our reason says, we don't know. We can't understand. This cannot be explained. And yet I believe. And that is large enough without trying to carve out giant-size exceptions to everything else in the world. And by doing so, oftentimes missing the incredible message that those stories were meant to convey in the first place, which is physical is impressive, physical is powerful, physical can change the world, but it is the essence of a person. It is the essence of a person that is guided by Torah that is the true measure of greatness that we should be looking for and that we should be pursuing for ourselves. You don't have to be a physical giant to be a spiritual giant. And in this world, let alone the next, it is the spiritual giants that ultimately triumph. That is what we must remember, and that is how we have to continue to try and grow. Well, I'm glad this seems to have continued for the entire time and didn't fry my computer. So with that, we will finish up for today. Look forward to seeing you all or hearing from you if you wish to continue to discuss this. And as always, use the text that I link here so that you can continue in your own investigations. There is always much more to learn. Use the mind God gave you.